By the late 1950s, American horror cinema had become overrun with giant atomic monsters and aliens from outer space, as studios used science fiction stories with huge spectacle and gimmicks to drive young teenage audiences into movie theatres. Meanwhile, over in the UK, horror filmmakers were looking back, returning to gothic houses and classic monsters. Hammer Studios had achieved huge success with The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957 and The Horror of Dracula in 1958, both of which were directed by Terence Fisher and both of which, of course, starred Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing. These two films kicked off a new golden age of classic horror monsters over in the UK. While Hammer Studios tended to avoid movies involving the horror of nature and the outdoors, there were a few exceptions, particularly films that portrayed the dangers of the British countryside. But compared to the spectacular 3D movies of this era coming out of Hollywood, like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Hammer always managed to maintain their signature gothic sensibility. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of nature in horror, and we discuss two beloved Hammer classics, The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Reptile. Welcome back to the evolution of horror. My name is Mike Muncer, and as ever, I am your host. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the history and the evolution of the horror genre, one subgenre at a time. We are currently in our 10th season, exploring nature biting back in horror, and this is part 6. In this week's episode, as that intro suggested, it's Hammer Horror Week. We are going to be dipping into two Hammer classics from the 50s and 60s. That's The Hound of the Baskervilles from 1959 and The Reptile from 1966. Both of these discussions will be spoilerific. Give them a watch before you listen to our discussion. I sat down with a friend of the pod and Hammer horror enthusiast Graham Saunders to discuss these two movies in depth. I was in the Midlands hosting a screening. He was there, so we got together on the day of our screening to discuss Hammer horror movies together. So please enjoy my conversation with Graham Saunders about The Hound of the Baskervilles and The Reptile. A big welcome back to Graham Saunders. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Michael.
Hello. Well, welcome back. We're here to talk about the great outdoors, nature, Graham, animal attacks and all of these kind of movies. What are your kind of general thoughts on that area of horror? Movies like Jaws, The Birds, those kind of things.
Oh, I mean, very much like them. I remember going to see Jaws with my parents in 1975, age 10.
Fantastic.
It was an A certificate, so you could actually get into the cinema. So that was a treat. Yeah, I mean, I do. I there's so many, and of course it crosses genres. So anything, say, from them, is sort of that they're there in. You could argue that even the Alien franchise is nature attacks in some way.
Yes, definitely.
So it's all pervasive, yeah. And again, straight films like The Birds, which I know you're going to be covering on this series. It's that fear of that idea of the uncanny, that something that we know, a harmless bird can suddenly attack without any reason at all.
I think that is what makes it scary, isn't it? You know, we've talked about this a little bit already, but when it comes to kind of nature, it will do what it does. There's no malice, actually. It's just doing what it does, right? But you can't reason with that. There's something almost more frightening than an intruder in your house who you think you might be able to reason with in theory, right? You know,
yes.
But sharks are going to eat you no matter what. Are you much of an animal person, Graham? Are you somebody that is like, you know, outdoorsy in general?
Well, I'm not outdoorsy. I did survive a shark attack many years. Well, many years ago, I was in Miami, and I stupidly always swim out far too far. And I was out there and I suddenly heard the lifeguard telling everybody, it was like a scene from Jaws, telling everybody to get out of the water. So I started to swim nonchalantly back. Yeah. And then I realized everyone else was on the shore watching me. And then suddenly I realized I was the only person in the water. And the lifeguard suddenly said, "Sir, just stopped swimming. And then I realized, I never looked back. I managed to float to the shore. And I suddenly did visualize. I suddenly went very calm.
That's interesting.
But it was like a scene. When I saw all the people on the shore, it was something out of Spielberg's Jaws. They were just, I'd imagine I would float up like that Lilo. Like the bloody Lilo. So I got out of the water. And then people said, well, apparently the shark was circling me, but it didn't actually come in for the attack. I've been stung by the sea's not very kind to me. I've been stung by jellyfish in Barcelona. I've been
so you're used to all this then, really.
But I'm not really. I like most evolution of horror fans. I suspect most people don't go out into the country very much.
Pretty indoorsy generally. Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any personal kind of phobias of anything like that?
I don't like rats.
I remember
you talking about with Kevin Lyons about your hearing mice. I don't like rats. So films like Willard and Ben, I don't like those films. They do give me the creeps.
There is something innate in us, and probably there is that link of, they carry disease and everything else, right? There's not many people I imagine that would be particularly fond of rats. I think
it's one of the great moments in Nosferatu when all of the rats come out of the ship,
and they have remained extremely popular. I feel like these days, animal attack movies, shark attack movies, slightly more B movies a lot of the time, but they're still just as popular as ever, right?
Absolutely. Well, in the 70s, there was this whole rash of novels. People like James Herbert's The Rats. Guy N. Smith's Night of the Crabs. That idea of nature attacking. And rabies as well. I remember in the 70s, rabies was a big thing. So films, novels like The Rage and
Cujo, of course.
Of course, Cujo. Yes. So Stephen King and ventures into that territory as well.
And it's a hard thing to pull off, I think. And maybe we'll talk about this, with Hammer, for example, don't really do these types of movies. And I think there is something quite big scale about these movies. Sometimes you do need a filmmaker like Hitchcock or Spielberg to pull these off effectively, don't you? Because how do you make these animals look realistic and all of this kind of thing? It's quite a tricky thing to do, isn't it?
I think in both the films we're going to be talking about today, Hound of the Baskervilles and The Reptile, Hammer don't really pull off the title creatures.
No, they don't. It's so funny. And why do you think that is? We're going to talk about two movies here that very vaguely, I suppose, fall under this kind of bracket. But like I said, Hammer didn't really venture into these types of movies, did they? And do you think that's just because of the restrictions of Hammer, the fact that they were often, filmed on sets and again, like they had a very kind of particular format, didn't they? I suppose.
Very much so. I mean, they're raiding the Universal horrors in this up until sort of mid 1960s.
Yes.
And I think there wasn't really that interest. The Curse of the Werewolf, you could argue that the werewolf sequence, the Universal werewolf films with Lon Chaney Jr., that's a sort of nature bites back.
Werewolf movies do kind of fit in this bracket.
But interesting that Hammer only ever did one werewolf film.
Yes. Although, funnily, I was reading, a lot of people have talked about The Reptile as being a kind of werewolf film in a way, which it sort of is, isn't it? Really, it's just a different animal, but it's a very similar thing. So let's kick things off. We're gonna talk about, like you say, Hound of the Baskervilles and The Reptile. Let's begin with The Hound of the Baskervilles from 1959.
Know then the legend of the Hound of the Baskervilles. Take heed. And beware the moor in those dark hours when evil is exalted. Else you will surely meet the Hound of Hell, the Hound of the Baskervilles.
Which way? For heaven's sake, which way?
The greatest story ever written by one of the world's greatest storytellers, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's classic masterpiece of mystery, suspense, and horror, The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Some revolting sacrificial rite has been performed. What depth a human being can sink to.
What human being could have done this?
That is precisely what I intend to find out.
But how can you be so certain that somebody took one of the bishop's spiders and deliberately placed it in Sir Henry's room? That it wasn't in the luggage he brought from South Africa?
Elementary, my dear Watson. There are no tarantulas in South Africa.
Graham, set the scene for us. Tell us a little bit about The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Well, it's based on a 1902 novella by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, famously filmed in 1939 with Basil Rathbone and Nigel Bruce. And it might be of interest, actually, for people to watch the two back to back. I think it would be instructive to do so. The plot: Holmes is alerted to a case related to a curse going back several centuries to Hugo Baskerville. Dr. Mortimer reports that the legend of the Hound may be implicated in the death of Sir Henry Baskerville, who has died of a heart attack. The heir to the Baskerville estate is based over in Canada. He comes back to claim his inheritance. Holmes interviews him at his hotel. Strangely, a boot has gone missing. In the Hammer film, there is a spider attack. A tarantula is left out for him. Watson accompanies him down to Devon. There he meets various characters, including a priest, Franklin, and the Stapletons, a mysterious couple. One Stapleton in Hammer has webbed fingers and a Spanish daughter. The Hound's location is found, although the Hound is not there, in an abandoned mine. It turns out that the Stapletons are related to the Baskervilles and are using the legend of the Hound, like Scooby-Doo, to scare off and kill
with a mask.
With a mask.
So
yes, funny. There is even a rubber mask, as in Scooby-Doo. And plan to kill off Sir Hugo, who has a congenital heart condition. They are thwarted. In the end, Cecile, the daughter, dies in the Great Grimpen Mire.
Yes.
And Stapleton is savaged to death by the Hound. That's a very, very brief synopsis. It's great. Because there's a lot going on.
There's a lot going on. Yeah. So what do you think of the film, first of all, generally, Graham? Are you a fan of this adaptation?
I think it's good. I mean, the Hammer version really plays fast and loose.
It does.
With it, but to great effect. Also, this is the first colour Sherlock Holmes film.
Yes,
which
of course.
itself is significant.
Yeah, I liked it actually. I think it's got a good kind of. It's got that very classic kind of early Hammer kind of gothic atmosphere, doesn't it? And it works well. Obviously, this particular text for Hammer, you can see why they chose to adapt it. But I think it's again, you can see that there are those kind of like limitations, I suppose, with Hammer, as always.
Yes, I mean, also it does lend itself to Hammer's gothic treatment of themes, because it's probably the most gothic of the Sherlock Holmes short stories and novellas.
Exactly. Yeah. Like, how do you, let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about this before, but the kind of the eras of Hammer, I suppose. This kind of feels very much like that kind of, it's the early Hammer horror era, right? Just came off the back of their Dracula and Frankenstein movies, I believe, right?
Yes. So this is seen by some as the golden age of Hammer.
Yeah.
So the year before Dracula has come out, 1956, The Curse of Frankenstein. The Mummy comes out in the same year as Hound of the Baskervilles. They'd done Quatermass as well earlier in sort of 55. So this is the period where they are exploring those great universal horrors and rewriting and re-envisaging them.
Yes. Excellent. And I mean, you've talked a little bit about this, but you're more keen on the kind of later era, aren't
I
you?
am. Yes.
What is it about the earlier era that you like less, do you think?
I think sometimes the biggies, particularly some of the Dracula and Frankenstein films, drag.
Yeah. There's a bit. They can be a bit dry, can't they?
They can
sometimes. Those
so
early ones.
So, for example, in the Vampire series, when you were looking at Brides of Dracula and Kiss of the Vampire, I think they're much more interesting films than, say, Dracula, Prince of Darkness or Dracula Has Risen from the Grave.
Yes,
it's those B movies.
Yes.
These often were B movies. Well, Hound of the Baskervilles wasn't, but the Reptile was the B movie to Dracula, Prince of Darkness.
Yes.
So it's sometimes when Hammer are experimenting and they're not using the sort of they're not going down that path of very well-known monsters.
Yes.
That I find them more interesting. And I do like it when they're desperately casting around for ideas in the early 70s when we looked at Satanic Rites of Dracula.
Yes,
Dracula AD 1972.
Yeah.
I much prefer that to say Taste the Blood of Dracula or Scars of Dracula.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got Terence Fisher obviously directing here, who was he was the kind of Hammer director at the time, wasn't he? How do you find his direction and the way he kind of tells this story?
Well, I might be unpopular in what I say here. Some see Terence Fisher as an auteur. There is even that little BFI book on Terence Fisher, which makes a really good case for him as an auteur. I see him as a bit more of a jobbing director.
Yeah.
Saying that, there are moments in Hound of the Baskervilles where there's some really interesting stuff. So the beginning where the servant is thrown, the first thing we see in the film is the servant thrown through this glass window onto the ground. But for me, he's a director for hire, and some people may well disagree with this because I don't. The thing with Fisher, I couldn't tell it's a Terence Fisher film.
No.
When I can see it's a David Lynch film immediately. I can see it's a Hitchcock film. There's a signature.
Yes.
That signature for me isn't there with Fisher, but I know lots of people would disagree with me.
Well, it's interesting. Yes, I know what you mean, because I think, when you've got a studio that is it's studio led rather than auteur led, I suppose. Hammer, isn't it? You've got your recognizable sets and actors, and it's like a company of people, isn't it, as opposed to a single director's vision, it feels like, and he is fairly traditional. He does make some really interesting choices occasionally, but it is a lot of wide shots of men in drawing rooms, and that kind of thing, isn't it, often with Hammer? And yeah, you're right. How much of that is Terence Fisher? How much of it is just he's coming on as a director for hire and doing what he needs to do, I suppose,
Yes. I mean, and he's someone who'd worked for other companies as well as Hammer.
Yes.
But I mean, saying that, I shouldn't, take anything away from him, because he's good with actors. I get that impression from from hearing accounts of people who work with him. He was a director who worked very well with actors.
Yes.
Whereas some directors, people like David Lean, is technically a brilliant director, but apparently an absolute shit to work with if you were an actor.
Yes, absolutely.
You hear the awful stories of his last film, Passage to India, where he reduces some of the cast to tears.
Yeah, absolutely. And you get that with people like Kubrick, of course, and probably Hitchcock a little bit as well, right? Yeah, yes. Whereas he was, again, they were very much all part of a family, I think. These guys,
you get the impression, you hear about them all eating in the same canteen.
Yes,
and,
exactly.
Sharing rides.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and of course you've got Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee back, right, as well as a whole bunch of other kind of Hammer regulars. What do you think of Peter Cushing as Sherlock Holmes?
Well, I think he's brilliant in it. And indeed, he played Holmes later for the BBC around about 10 years later, around about 68.
Yes.
The BBC filmed a series of Sherlock Holmes stories with Cushing. I've seen one or two of them on YouTube. I don't know if they're available or not on DVD. But he gets the ruthlessness of Holmes.
Yes.
But it's interesting. We've had so many people who've made that part themselves.
Yeah.
For themselves. Basil Rathbone, Benedict Cumberbatch, I guess, has really made that role for himself. And Jeremy Brett during the 1980s on terrestrial British television filmed a whole series of them. But Cushing captures some of that coldness of Holmes really well, and arrogance. There's that great moment when he lulls Sir Henry into a false sense of security when he's going to have a meal with the Stapletons, and he says, "Enjoy your rabbit pie with your peasant friends."
Yes. Well, he is like Sherlock Holmes is an interesting character, isn't he? And he is one of the most portrayed characters ever, I think, isn't he? As kind of alongside Dracula in terms of the amount of adaptations there have been. But he's a bit of a shit, Sherlock Holmes, isn't he? Let's be honest. He's a bit of an arrogant shit.
I mean, there's a great moment in the novel when Watson says, Holmes wasn't interested in learning about how the Earth goes around the sun. He's only interested in things like, different varieties of type font on the Times, or different types of tobacco.
Yes, exactly.
He's written that monograph, hasn't he, on, was it 40 types of tobacco?
Yeah.
So he's an obsessive.
Absolutely. And I think Peter Cushing, I mean, he's very good at playing kind of villainous characters, but there is also something just inherently quite likeable about Peter Cushing too. So I think he brings that balance of, he's still got that kind of arrogance of Holmes in this and that aggression, but also you do root for him in this, don't you? I think
you forget he plays Doctor Who.
Yes.
For 2 films in the mid 60s.
Yeah.
So he can do Avuncular, and he can do, or in films like Journey to the Earth's Core, he plays the sort of the hero scientist.
Yeah.
So he can play. I mean, Cushing is so good at playing both villain, but also, there's much more to him than that.
Yeah. He and Christopher Lee, I think, spoke about him that he was always so impressed at Peter Cushing's ability to act with props and things. Right?
Peter, yes.
Prop Peter. He always, and in this movie, you see him scenes where he's lighting his pipe and he's doing something else with his other hand and he's walking around. Like he's very good at all of that kind of stuff, and he makes it look very natural, doesn't he? I think.
Yeah, and I think that comes from a background in theatre.
Yes.
Often theatre actors like a prop.
Absolutely.
To play with, and he does all sorts of things. He does all sorts of great stuff in this.
And again, there is something theatre-like, I find, about a lot of Hammer films, particularly these more traditional Hammer films. Like I said, these kind of wide shots of people coming in and out of rooms and the blocking and the actors maybe who come from theatre backgrounds as well. Like there is, and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, but there is something that seems quite theatrical sometimes about Hammer,
Yes.
Yes.
And I think a lot of British film.
Yeah.
Directors like James Whale comes from from the West Midlands where we are speaking today.
Yes.
He comes from a theatre background into film, as do so many. Not even British directors as well. A lot of the German emigres who have come from theatre, or are refugees from the German theatre scene and working in Hollywood.
Hello, everybody. Just interrupting this week's episode momentarily to thank this week's sponsor. That is a $20 Patreon subscriber, Bailey Greer. Bailey sent me a lovely message, which I'm going to read out now. She said, "Hello, Mike. I'm a huge fan of EOH, and I'm incredibly excited about your Twin Peaks podcast with Stacey Ponder. Cannot wait to rewatch and listen along. I am a photographer based in Nashville, Tennessee, and I would love to promote my Halloween-themed photography zine, Hallowzine. Back issues are available on wellssometimes.com. If EOH listeners are fans of 35mm film photography and the spooky season, please check it out. Issue 3 will be available in early fall 2024. You can also check out more of my work on Instagram at Bailey Greer. I'm really enjoying the Nature Bites back season and always look forward to what you have in store for us on Patreon. Thank you very much." Oh, Bailey, thank you so much for that lovely message. And I'm just having a look through your Instagram posts. Your photography is awesome. Very much my jam. I love it. So if people want to come and check out Bailey's work, you can find her on Instagram. Her name's Bailey, Balee Greer, Greer. You can also check out her Halloween zine, her Hallowzine, and back issues, which are available on wellsometimes.com. And get in there for issue 3 coming out in the autumn of 2024. Very, very cool. One more time, a huge thank you to this week's sponsor, $20 Patreon subscriber, Bailey Greer. And don't forget, if you want to become an official Evolution of Horror sponsor, get your own little dedicated segment in an episode just like Bailey, then you simply need to sign up to our Patreon at the $20 level. That's the highest tier on Patreon. For that, you will get access to every single bit of bonus content available, and you will get to send me a little message, anything you like, where you can plug your own work or just say anything you want to be said, basically, and I will get it read out for you in an upcoming episode on the main podcast. Just head to patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Graham, let's talk about Christopher Lee's performance in this, because I think it's interesting, right? Off the back of him playing, obviously, Dracula and Frankenstein's creature with Hammer, this is a kind of different kind of role for him, isn't it?
Yes, and it's great to actually see him talking.
Yes.
And playing the romantic lead.
Yes, I mean, because he is quite charming and good-looking.
He's a good-looking man,
isn't he?
yes.
Yeah.
And, I think it stretches his chops a little bit in this, because the next thing he's in is The Mummy.
Yes.
Which,
back to playing monsters.
He's in bandages, and he's pretty much silent throughout that film. So in actual fact, he plays it just really nicely. Because it's not, so Hugo is not Lee himself has said it's not the most interesting role.
No.
But it's there. And also his romantic interest for Cecile in this.
Yeah. And it's interesting that because he is this big, imposing guy, and usually most films make the most of that. And in this movie, he is the one that's in danger, the one that needs saving almost, right? He's almost the kind of like the damsel in distress type character that the other characters need to save. And that's kind of interesting with Christopher Lee doing that. I love that moment when he's got the spider on him and there's just his facial expressions getting more and more terrified, He's great in it though, isn't he? Really good.
Yes, strange the use of the tarantula. Because of course in the novel, I think they fire a shot, if memory serves me rightly, from the carriage. But here, of course, they're using... a la Dr. No. There's a tarantula, which is not particular. Apparently the tarantula in this film is called Mary. And of course, we get lots of red herrings because, of course, then Franklin also is collecting, collects these spiders.
Well, it's interesting because, again, for a movie that is a kind of classic mystery in a way and doesn't quite fit the kind of nature bites back theme in the way that some other movies do. It is interesting that most of the danger does come from animals in this film or nature. You've got a character drowning in the mire and you've got a character mauled by a dog. You've got the addition of the tarantula as well. The animals are sort of used as weapons by people, I suppose. Right?
Very much so. And in the novel, one of the horrible moments in the novel is where a pit pony is heard screaming as it's sucked into the mire. So the landscape itself is hostile.
Yes,
the great Grimpen Mire that if you don't know your way around it, it's going to suck you under.
Yes. Let's talk a little bit about that, because this is the first movie so far this series that we're talking about that's set in Britain, and Dartmoor particularly, and the way it's used in this. How effective is that as part of this story, do you think?
Very much so. I mean, again, even more effective in the novel.
Yes.
Because, of course, one of the things we don't get in the film that you get in the novel is that Mortimer is a part-time archaeologist.
Yes.
And he's dug up a prehistoric skull.
Yes.
So there's this other civilization buried on the moor of prehistoric man, and so there are the barrows, and of course Holmes is hiding in the novel in one of those barrows. So in actual fact, the moor is a place of secrets, and I suppose hidden histories. And it's also isolated. In the novel, there's hardly anyone living on the moor at all.
Yes,
we don't, because of strictures in budget, we don't see much of the moor apart from the quicksand. And interestingly, Hammer use an abandoned mine.
Yeah, it's interesting. Again, it goes back to the idea of Hammer, favouring kind of smaller claustrophobic indoor spaces as opposed to trying to create these vast outdoor spaces, right? But I think, again, that it brings something a bit more gothic to it. One of the things that James Swanton said to me when we discussed King Kong was that the one thing that this subgenre sort of lacks a lot of the time is that idea of the gothic, whereas actually these movies very much still feel very much in that kind of traditional gothic horror, way, don't they?
Yes. I mean, most of the films, I guess, that you're going to be looking at, I suspect they will be dispensing with any sort of gothic elements. It's
again, you think
different.
of Bodega Bay and Amity Island and these kind of big, bright, outdoor modern spaces. There's nothing kind of gothic really about a lot of those stories.
No, the only one I can think of, and I don't know I don't know whether you're going to tackle it or not. Probably not. The Island of Dr. Moreau.
Yes. No, I'm going to save that for another series.
Yeah,
actually,
because that's got elements of the Gothic, and it's interesting. Another contemporary of Conan Doyle, H.G. Wells, writes that.
Yes.
And in actual fact, that little novella is really disturbing.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's interesting that it still retains that sense of the Gothic. But like you say, this movie does change quite a lot from the original text, doesn't it?
Very much
How
so.
do you find that, the way in which they've adapted this story and the changes they've made?
I like the changes.
Yeah.
It's always that thing, isn't it? People get very het up about changing classic text, but the classic text is always there.
Yeah, exactly.
So you don't.
And
don't
there are
worry about
plenty of
it.
other adaptations, right?
It's the same thing what people do to Shakespeare. It's still there. Don't worry, folks.
Yeah,
the folio is still there. They do play fast and loose with it, and they condense it. So, for example, we don't get chapter 1 where Holmes is explaining. There's that lovely thing of him. Dr. Mortimer has left his cane, so he uses it to do a wonderful character sketch. We're also in the film. We're straight into the legend. And then we are back in 221B Baker Street. The other really interesting thing I think they do with it that makes a big departure from the previous film and the novel is that it's Cecile who is the villain. Stapleton himself, who is the villain in the novel, in Conan Doyle's novel, Beryl Stapleton, as she's known, is the heroine. She tries to warn Sir Henry and about the dangers. And effectively, she's kept as a sort of captive.
Yes,
they actually aren't brother and sister in the novel. Here, she is this vengeful Spaniard who hates being in Britain, and she is related to the Baskervilles. So she leads Sir Henry on and leads him to his death. So Stapleton, her brother, plays a subsidiary role.
Yes,
it's Cecile who is the villainess, which I think is interesting.
Yeah,
and also using they cut out lots of things about Holmes disguising himself as a beggar.
yes.
We don't get so much of Selden, the convict. That's pretty much dispensed with, as is the plot with the Barrymore signalling. It's there, but they do a really Hammer are good actually at taking big texts like Dracula and Frankenstein and cutting them down to about 80 minutes.
Absolutely. They're very economical, and they cut all the fat, don't they?
They do.
Stories. Absolutely. Hound of the Baskervilles, right? It is one of, I would, arguably, right, probably the most beloved, the most popular Sherlock Holmes story. There are so many brilliant Sherlock stories, but why is this one so popular? It's been adapted so many times. What is it about the Hound of the Baskervilles, do you think?
It's got those horror elements in it, and occasionally Doyle touches on them in some of the other short stories, like the Sussex Vampire.
Yes.
But it's always explained away. Here, he writes this in 1902. This is the world, M.R. James's ghost stories are being published. There's a big interest in the supernatural. And Conan Doyle himself was a big believer in spiritualism. And of course, there's the famous case with the fairies that he, that were a photographic hoax that he believed.
That's right. Yes.
So the supernatural finds its way into Holmes, and it's that combination of of Holmes's rational logic and the legend of the Hound, and the way that he writes so beautifully about this very strange locale, and the way of creating atmosphere. Also, Holmes isn't in the novel very much. It's Watson who takes center stage in the novel with his narratives.
Yes, and I suppose that there's an element of that in this film, isn't there? There's a chunk of this film where it's Watson, down in Dartmoor without Holmes as well.
Yes, which I like. Watson again is played by Andre Morel in this, and he's very different from the buffoonish Nigel Bruce, the comic foil in the Universal series. Here he's solid.
Yes,
he's solid and reliable, and he carries the film. Andre Morel turns up in so many Hammer films.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. You've got a lot of kind of regulars here, haven't you? I
Yes,
think,
you have.
Yeah. And again, we didn't really mention it, but Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, their chemistry together is always so great, isn't it?
Very much so.
Yeah.
Very much so.
Yeah, they have so much respect for each other as performers, I think, as well, and sort of give each other room, I think. You can feel that, can't you? What about the horror itself then? We mentioned that moment with the tarantula, the dogs at the end. How effective do you find these moments of horror?
Not particularly effective, Mike. Not particularly effective. No, I mean there is the stories of the Hound that they made a rubber mask for this rather tame dog called Colonel, who. They experimented. They just couldn't get it right. They apparently footage was filmed with children, so that the Hound would look bigger,
right? Yes,
which was apparently looked awful. It's best when they do the best of a bad job. The mask with the dog. I mean, the novel. It's fluorescently coloured.
It's kind of phosphorus or whatever it's called.
Phosphorus dog. But this really is not particularly frightening. Luckily, it's shot very quickly. So again, Terence Fisher uses some good edits to just about get away with it. But there's a very unconvincing stuffed dog by the looks of it that's attacking Christopher Lee. The tarantula is about as threatening as it is in Doctor No. I don't quite. I know some people hate spiders.
Yeah. Tarantulas aren't even poisonous though.
No, I mean, but of course, if you've got a heart condition, then the bite can be fatal. No, the elements of horror in this are not scary. So nature isn't really biting back. And in fact, nature is under the power of the Stapletons. It's being used as it's being co-opted into a murderous scheme. So
the most deadly thing in this film is probably the quicksand, right? The mire,
the mire, which will take everything. Yes,
that is the most dangerous kind of natural element in this. I suppose. So funny. I remember I was talking about this with somebody recently. Growing up in the sort of 80s and early 90s. Quicksand felt like it was always something in fiction and films and TV shows. We were always scared of quicksand.
Never
really needed to be that worried about quicksand.
No, apparently
to be honest.
I'm told that it doesn't. It turns up in things like Tarzan films.
Yes,
but also there's that thing. I guess there's that in the UK that public information film with deadly water.
Yes,
and also children. The other danger never really happened to me as a child. Are slurry pits.
Yeah.
There's a public information film with a slurry pit. A child disappearing down a slurry pit.
Yeah, they're very specific, aren't they? These things that they warned us about.
Very much so. Yeah, children were. Well, I think children, because we were roaming around on our chopper bikes a lot, they were much more it was a much more dangerous time for children than it is now.
I love it. So there you go. I mean, anything else you want to mention? How do you think that this movie just generally kind of holds up now? As in amongst the other kind of in amongst the other kind of golden era Hammer films.
I think it's one. It's one I can still watch.
Yeah.
I think
it's very watchable, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I love Curse of Frankenstein. I think it's a better film than Dracula.
Yes.
I think it's a better film than The Mummy. It's a cracking good adventure.
Yeah.
And I'm very surprised that Hammer didn't revisit some of the other
I'm quite
Sherlock Holmes films after this.
You've got there already just like great little stories, right? That lend themselves very well in a way to Hammer and Hammer style. Yeah.
Very much so. And I that I think is a missed opportunity. Then they do films like Lost Continent, and films that really don't work. They're also, by this time in the late 50s, they're still making war-based films like Camp on Blood Island.
That's right. Yeah. They're still kind of finding their way as a horror studio.
Yeah, they are not completely out of the of the fact that they were a quickie company.
Yes.
Producing all sorts of stuff prior to Dracula.
Yeah. I really like it too. I think it's a great, this marriage of Conan Doyle's stories with Hammer's filmmaking just kind of feels like a match made in heaven. Like, I think it works so well. I think that it looks great. The production design, Terence Fisher's direction is great, solid, great performances, a great mystery, obviously, at the heart of it. As with all Hammer horror films, for me, it doesn't affect me as a horror film. I don't find it particularly frightening, but it's a good watch. It's a fun, entertaining, rollicking watch, I would say.
Yeah, I think, you know, out of the many Sherlock Holmes films, I think this is in my, you know, I would say this is in my top 3.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there you go. That is The Hound of the Baskervilles from 1959.
The Mask of the Red Death. Personalized by the motion picture screen's Prince of Horror, Vincent Price.
Then shouldn't you be on your knees to give thanks?
No, I beg of you! Mercy, mercy!
Lavishly, he plants his corrupting seeds of sin, spreading living terror that not even the unsullied can escape.
That was a little clip you heard there from The Mask of the Red Death, the incredible Edgar Allan Poe adaptation starring Vincent Price and directed by the late, great Roger Corman. Roger Corman, who, of course, we lost a couple of weeks ago at the age of 98. So incredible. I mean, like, his career... Is there a more important person, a more important titan in the kind of horror community or just in modern Hollywood cinema in general, right? So I felt like we had to do something to pay homage to this absolute master of cinema over on Patreon. So coming up on Patreon in the next week, I'm going to be joined by the brilliant Tim Coleman, and we are going to be bringing you another edition of our Legends of Horror mini-series. So Legends of Horror is a strand available for $10 patrons where we talk about a huge important figure in the horror community and talk about their life and career. We've covered Vincent Price, Wes Craven, Stephen King, and a whole bunch of other titans of the horror genre. And so next week we will be covering the life and career of Roger Corman. Not only that, we'll be finishing with an in-depth discussion of The Mask of the Red Death, one of his most beloved horror movies. And of course, it felt like the perfect opportunity to plug this because if you're into Hammer horror and the movies that we're covering this week on the main podcast, and you haven't checked out Roger Corman's Edgar Allan Poe adaptations from around this same time, you must check them out. They are as good as, if not better than, I think, Hammer horror films. So yeah, I'm really excited to discuss that one with Tim Coleman. If you want to check that out, you need to sign up to our Patreon at a $10 level. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. You can also sign up at a $5 level where you won't get access to our mini-seasons, but you'll still get regular monthly bonus episodes, including our monthly strand Fresh Blood, in which Brad Hanson, Becky Dark, Steph McKenna and I discuss and review all of the new releases in horror. This month's episode just dropped. We discussed The Strangers Chapter 1, Sting, the new series of Doctor Who, and a bunch of other stuff over there. So $5 patrons will get access to that. But everybody who signs up, no matter what tier, will also get a little shout out on the main podcast as a thank you. So speaking of, I'm going to give everybody who signed up in the month of March this year a special thanks. So a big thank you to Jesse Iacott, Christopher Reitmeyer, Joe Hunter, Katie, Megan Stevenson, Ryan McKenzie, Brianna Espinoza, Jordan Elise Fish, Danny Nicholson, Array McCauley, Final Girl 86, Isaac, Ross Kane, Matt Scotcher, Jane Skinner, Ziggy Rosaldo, Carl, Peyton Qualls, Barbara Lane, Jennifer, Natalie Guzzi, Erica Beard, Nicholas Edenholm, and Colin Mullet. A huge thank you to all of those people for signing up to our Patreon in the month of March. We'll bring you more thank yous for the people that signed up in April in the next couple of episodes. But in the meantime, if you want to sign up, get treated to regular bonus content and more, then sign up now. Patreon.com/evolution of horror. That's patreon.com/evolution of horror. Okay, let's return to the second half of this week's episode, in which Graham Saunders and I jump forward to 1966 to discuss Hammer Horror's weird supernatural monster movie, The Reptile.
In this remote little country village, the mortal remains of a man are laid to rest.
Who is it this time, Peter? It's Mr. Spaulding. They found him this morning. Just like the other.
Just like the others, he died in the night.
Get away!
Suddenly, violently, horribly.
This is an evil place. Corrupt and evil.
Evil, as venomous as a snake, turns the quiet of this village into a writhing hell on earth, where every man fears for his safety and his sanity, where everyone is suspect.
Do you mean they died by some sort of magic, some witchcraft? For the first time in my life, I'm frightened.
Everyone is frightened. The doctor who'd lived his life in the East. This man who could be the next victim. This woman and this girl are frightened, hypnotized by the crawling, creeping spell of the reptile.
Stop!
So, The Reptile, this was released in March of 1966. So we've jumped forward 7 years. We're into the kind of Hammer's middle era, right? It's a little bit different by this point, Hammer horror and the sorts of films they made. And this is an interesting, weird little film directed by John Gilling. Graham, set us up. Give us a little plot synopsis of The Reptile.
The film starts with a man called Charles Spaulding, who has had a note from a guy called Dr. Franklin to go and visit his house. Goes to the house. He's bitten by a shadowy, human-like figure, and quickly starts to change colour, froth at the mouth.
Yes.
He is dumped by a sinister Malayan manservant who belongs to the Franklin household. His brother, Harry, comes to claim his brother's inheritance. This is set down in Cornwall. He comes to claim his inheritance with his bride, Valerie, and they inherit a cottage. They decide to stay there. So as they arrive, they go to the pub, and Harry has this great gift of emptying a pub.
Yeah.
He can empty a pub very, very quickly.
Yes, the locals aren't.
The locals don't like him.
No.
So he empties the pub not once but twice in this film.
Yes.
There have been a series of mysterious deaths known as the Black Death, where people have been mysteriously dying. The cottage is seen as an evil place by the locals. He goes to the cottage to find that it's been wrecked. Goes back to the pub, clears it out again because he accuses the villagers of trashing his cottage. He meets on the moor a character called Mad Peter. Mad Peter, played by John Laurie. I'm sure we can talk more about him later.
Yes.
Who talks about that this is an evil place. This is an evil place. And Harry wants to find out more from Peter, so he invites him to dinner. He says that things have changed since they arrived.
Yes.
He then hears this strange sort of snake charming like music, which Harry also hears. Peter rushes out, but is attacked. Comes back in the dead of night back to Harry's house, and again very quickly dies. But before he dies, he utters the word Dr. Franklin.
Yes.
Harry goes over to meet this rather standoffish Dr. Franklin, who reluctantly comes to see if he can help Mad Peter, who has died in the interim. Then Valerie is visited by Franklin's daughter, Anna, a mysterious young woman played by Jacqueline Pearce, who invites her to dinner. She's quickly pursued by her father. And in fact, Valerie has met Dr. Franklin before, who has looked for his errant daughter, who seems to go off a-wandering around the Cornwall countryside. They go to dinner, although Anna isn't allowed to come down. She's in her 30s, but she's not allowed to come down to dinner.
Yes.
Although she is allowed to come down to play the sitar, and we will perhaps talk about the sitar playing moment. The sitar playing moment.
Yes.
But the sitar playing seems to very much agitate her father. The sitar is smashed to pieces. The local landlord, Tom Bailey, helps Harry to disinter the bodies of Mad Peter and his brother, and they both have king cobra bites.
Yes.
Harry is also bitten by this creature. He rushes back to the house. Jennifer burns out the bite. Fortunately, She discovers the note that Anna has left. She foolishly goes to the house. She goes down to the cellar, a convenient sulfur pit. The house is also very hot. We forget to say this.
Very hot.
It's very hot. There's a sulfur pit, which presumably provides their central heating.
Yes. It's got lovely underfloor heating.
Yes. There's a mysterious figure underneath a blanket. Franklin just before also discovers a nightie with his with the shed skin of presumably his daughter, which he moves with a sword. Valerie confronts Franklin, who tells the story that Anna had been abducted while they were in Borneo by a mysterious snake cult. The Malay servant has some sort of hold on Franklin. He says, "You cannot leave, Dr. Franklin. You may not leave." So he has somehow learnt the secrets of these snake people, and they have punished him by turning his daughter periodically into a snake. She has shed her skin. She's currently in hibernation, but she's going to be coming back out, and it culminates with Anna coming back as the reptile, killing her father by biting him. Yes. And then she dies by this time. Tom and Harry have come back. They smash the window, releasing in the cold night air, and this sad scene where Anna, as the reptile, says, "I'm cold."
Yes.
I'm cold. And so the film ends. And of course, it ends in true Hammer style with a fire. Yeah. A fire has been set during actual fact, a fight where Franklin, you can see how convoluted this plot is, where Franklin has battled the Malayan servant and has set off a fire. So in lots of Hammer films, there is always usually a fire that ends.
That's right, a big fire, credits roll.
Purges.
But I do think it's funny that it's basically just they defeat the monster by just sort of opening a window.
Yes.
After all that, that's it, the end.
Yes, they do.
It's amazing. What do you think of this movie?
Oh, I like The Reptile a great deal. And I think it's a film that has increased in critical reputation over the years. A lot of these minor Hammer films, like Kiss of the Vampire and Brides of Dracula, have definitely increased their critical stock over the years.
Yeah, I really liked it as well. I think it's really fun. It's bonkers, and it's part of these like slightly more, like you describe them as the kind of the minor Hammer movies. They aren't the kind of big main ones, the Dracula, Frankenstein movies, etc. These kind of slightly off the beaten track Hammer films that they made in between the big projects are really fun and interesting, I think. And this one's great. I think it's got some great characters. I think Jacqueline Pearce is excellent. We'll talk about her as we go, but I think she, stands out, I think. And I like some of the kind of prosthetics in this. I think I like some of the effects. It's got a fun kind of mythology. And it really kind of rattles along, like most Hammer films, it gets kind of in and out within 90 minutes. So it's really fun. I think also what's really interesting, we should talk about the context of how this was made, because it was made back to back with Plague of the Zombies, I believe, right? To the point where it's a lot of the same actors. They reused some of the same sets and costumes, so it was really kind of made as a double feature, right?
Yes. I mean, that's the first time, actually, I think we met up on Evolution of Horror to talk about Plague of the Zombies. Hammer decided to do this strange experiment to save money to film 4 of their films back to back.
Yes, that's right.
So Dracula, Prince of Darkness, Plague of the Zombies, The Reptile, and Rasputin, the Mad Monk. Yes. And it might be a useful thing for Evolution of Horror listeners to watch those films back to back, and particularly The Reptile and Plague of the Zombies. Yeah. So 2 of the same cast members, Jacqueline Pearce and Michael Ripper. The sets are, and of course, they're both set in Cornwall.
Yes.
It's Cornish horror.
That's right, Cornish horror. Yeah, both have elements. We talked about this a bit with Plague of the Zombies, but both have an element of kind of folk horror to them, I think. Like the locals with a secret, the kind of hostile locals and all of that kind of thing. Like there is a kind of folk horror element to this movie, I think.
There is. But of course, then it's, as in Plague of the Zombies, there's also a colonialist element to it, that the zombies, this squire in that, has brought back from the Caribbean Julian, presumably, the secret of resurrecting the dead. And it's almost like he set up a sort of modern day, well, I say a Victorian slave plantation down in the mines. So you could certainly read this through both films. You could see as examples of the Empire Striking Back.
That's right. Yes. Of course, it's because you've got this kind of Indian kind of sort of curse, right?
Very much so. And Anna, of course, wears a sari. And she can play the sitar.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot of snake charming music, like you say, in this one, isn't there? Even the score, there are elements of kind of sort of Indian music and snake charm music within the score, I think, in this.
Yes, definitely. Yes, Hammer play that. And then, but also they're also using the sort of that trademark Hammer, that Hammer music that sort of they're using from sort of Dracula onwards.
So tell us a little bit about, you mentioned that there that this was filmed back to back with a bunch of other movies, and just remind us again, by this middle era, I suppose, of Hammer, they had started to kind of experiment, by the sounds of it, a bit more, right?
They had. I mean, so we're into the Reptile is released in 1966.
Yes.
So it's the same year they have their big hit, 1 Million Years BC. Yeah. Dracula, Prince of Darkness has come out. That's also a big hit. So they're really in their sort of middle period. Evil of Frankenstein has come out in 64. So they're very much hitting their stride with the Universal horror films, but they're also starting to go into new directions with getting in Ray Harryhausen for 1 Million Years BC.
Yes.
And then we've then got things like The Devil Rides Out in 67 and films like The Witches.
Yes.
So they're really, I guess, at their sort of peak before what some argue it's a decline.
Yes.
I would argue it's not. Critically, it's not a decline.
Yes.
Commercially, it is.
Yeah.
But they are already starting to do different things, and Plague of the Zombies and The Reptile, I think, are evidence of that. And they're also doing their psychodramas, films like Paranoiac.
Right.
And there's a lot of those films going on as well in the mid '60s, and The Anniversary as well with Bette Davis.
I was going to say the Bette Davis one,
The Nanny.
Yeah. The Witches is a great one. That's a favourite of mine.
I think it's hugely well, we discussed it very briefly, didn't we, when we spoke? I think it's hugely underrated as a folk horror and as an occult film.
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned on this one we've got the kind of Cornish backdrop. We've moved from Dartmoor to Cornwall here for this one, right? How do you find that the kind of the use of the location and again like the nature, I suppose, element of this movie?
Oh, very well. I mean, as you say, it's one of the best films for that cliche of the yokels. They even sing a Cornish sea shanty, which is interrupted. And they've all got the sort of Cornish half beards.
Yes.
Again, what the few outdoor scenes that we see are very effective. And again, watching Plague of the Zombies, which also uses the outside of the mine shaft, and you've also got sort of similar sort of interiors. I think work very well. And interestingly, though, there's a Cornish element. But why does Mad Peter, who is Scots, end up in Dorset?
Yes.
Dorset in Cornwall.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of Mad Peter?
Oh, Mad Peter's great. Well, he's played by John Laurie, who is a sort of doyen of British films from the 30s onwards. He's famously in Hitchcock's 39 Steps.
Oh yes, yeah,
where he betrays Richard Hannay. And UK television viewers would know him very much as Private Fraser in Dad's Army.
Yeah.
We're all doomed.
Yes.
We're all doomed.
Yeah.
Again, a classical actor.
Yeah.
Played Shakespeare. Here he's great. He's hamming it. He's hamming it for all it's worth. He's eye rolling. They call me Mad Peter, but I'm not really mad.
Yes.
And gnawing the chicken bones.
Yes. There's a comedy to it. There's an element of comedy to this. Actually, there was also in Hound of the Baskervilles, which we didn't really talk about, but the kind of the vicar character.
Miles Malleson. Yes.
Yeah. Who
Miles Malleson is great.
Kind of very British humour to that story.
Yes. Now, Miles Malleson, again, we see him, I think he's in Dead of Night, if I vaguely remember. But again, they play, this is where Hammer play fast and loose, because Franklin in the novel is this litigious, tenant, I don't know, well, sort of gentlemanly farmer, I think,
right,
who's always suing people. And again, in the Universal film, it's a comic. There's a long scene with him talking about suing his neighbours. Here, they've made him into an avuncular man of the cloth, who is sort of fond of drinking sherry and organising jumble sales.
Yes, it's so funny. Yeah,
and and it's a beautiful. Again, like Mad Peter, he's a scene stealer.
He is. He gets his little moment, doesn't he? And it's the same with Mad
he's
Peter.
Great. Yeah. And it's good to see these old character actors from a previous era turning up in Hammer.
Yes. What do you think of some of these other performances? So we've got Ray Barrett as Harry Spaulding and Jennifer Daniel as Valerie Spaulding, of course, in this. How do you find the other kind of central performances?
Those two performances are rather blank. I mean, Jennifer Daniels, I think she turns up in other Hammer films. I think the standout performances, though, are Jacqueline Pierce, who's also in Plague of the Zombies. Yeah. And she's really good. She's stunning in this. I mean, she has this sort of melancholic quality. And it's strange because, again, UK viewers would know Jacqueline Pierce probably more through the BBC television series in the late 1970s of Blake 7, where she's got cropped hair, she's much older, and she plays a sort of dominatrix character. The science fiction podcast that runs with James.
James and Matt from Journey Through Sci-Fi, and you taught all of us at university, Graham.
What did I do? What did I do to spawn?
I know all these nerdy podcasters that you created, Graham.
But she very much was the villainess in that.
Yes.
She plays a sort of dominatrix figure in that, completely different to the sort of two victims that she plays. And although the Reptile is this malevolent being, there's something really sad about her. But also at the same time, one of the most sinister elements, I think, in this is where she shows her pets.
Yeah.
So those poor pets are going to be,
animals,
they're obviously going to become, this is what she preys on when she's in reptile mode.
Yes. Yeah. And there are, like, again, there are a lot of kind of references to the natural world and the animals. There's that moment when they find a bear, like a trap for the rabbits outside and everything. And that room full of chickens and rabbits.
And the poor cat.
The poor cat. Yes.
I mean, I've got a little black cat that looks very much like
it's a very sweet little cat.
He gets thrown on sofas and gets abducted. And there's that I think one of the most disturbing scenes is when the Malay servant gives Anna the cat to play with, but clearly it's not to play with.
No.
So when she's sort of cuddling this poor kitten, I found the caged animals in that actually quite. I didn't like that. No. Disturbs me. And I know you've got rabbits.
Yes, yeah. As a rabbit owner, I was very concerned for these rabbits.
That's quite worrying. Also, we've not mentioned Michael Ripper, who is in the history of Hammer is a stalwart.
Yeah.
He's always playing supporting roles. He's also there in Plague of the Zombies. So again, if Evolution of Horror listeners have not watched The Reptile yet, do watch Plague of the Zombies first, and watch them back to back, because there'll be a lot of pleasure, making connections between the landscape, the sets, and the performances as well. Particularly Jacqueline Pierce, who, as I say, there's something also ethereal about her. She's a most unusual looking young woman, isn't she?
Yeah, she is. She's quite magnetic, isn't she? She's in the best moments, I would say. Yeah,
she's strange. She had an odd career. I mean, she turns up late in her career in that film White Mischief. But it's really playing Servalan in Blake 7 is the main role for which she's known.
Now comes the part of the episode where we thank our Kickstarter backers for helping us fund Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game. Oh my god, as we speak, on the weekend that this episode drops, me and my co-creators of Final Cut, Alex Ayling and Mike Lee Graham, are getting together because we finally have all 1,500 copies of the game. We're going to be packaging and sending out rewards over the next couple of weeks. So this is very, very exciting. So all of these backers whose names I'm about to read will be receiving their game very, very soon. So a huge thank you to all of our Kickstarter backers for help making this happen. A big thank you to Craig McManus, R. Brown, Marsha, Jane, Mark Bryan, Audrey, Lucy Foster, Christy, The Creative Fund, Michael Middleton, Tina Kirkham Ingram, Marcus Taylor, Alan Hunt, Paul Sandel, Chris Metcalf, Kevin Rowlandson, Shane, Charlie Babcock, Carl J, Todd, Bailey, Stephen Ripley, Katie Peltier, Laura Kennedy, Ethan Millsaps, Jake Pope, Sumner Momino, and Matt Socia. A huge thank you to all of those people for backing Final Cut, the official Evolution of Horror card game. It's finally happening. It's being manufactured as we speak. And if you missed out on the chance to back us on Kickstarter but want to get your hands on this card game, then keep an eye on our website or sign up to our newsletter. That way you'll be the first to know when we start selling them, and you can grab yours before it sells out. Just head to evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. That's evolutionofhorror.com/newsletter. Graham, let's talk about snakes for a moment. You know, this movie is called The Reptile. We are covering this in a Nature Bites Back series. Obviously, this is a supernatural monster here, but it is very much snake-like, of course, right? It's essentially a woman who is a giant snake, essentially. Snakes are... We're going to talk about them a lot throughout this series. I would say that snakes, spiders, sharks, these are probably the animals that are used the most frequently in horror and animal attack movies. How do you find the use of snakes in this film?
There's a great moment when Ray Barrett has broken into the home and suddenly he's confronted with a jump cut of the cobra, but it's actually a carving.
Yes.
They don't really make much. I mean, the skin of when in her 90, as I said, she's left her 90 behind, which is curious.
I like I think it's quite gross, the bites, the black bites that people have on their skin. There's something quite disturbing about that.
And the foaming at the mouth. Yes. The reptile makeup is not particularly brilliant.
No.
And it's best when she is in shadow. And they make good use of that. Of course, it's at the end when she is shown much more. But, you know, she's not alone in it. She's not alone in some of other things like the I don't know whether you're going to look at it. You probably won't. The Blood Beast Terror, which comes out a year afterwards, you know, with a giant moth. It's not particularly brilliant.
It's a hard thing to pull off, you know.
With Benedict Cumberbatch's mother in that is in that film.
That's interesting. It's such a hard thing to pull off. You know, we'll talk about this a little when we eventually get to our Jaws episode, and the amount of, you know, tricks that Spielberg has to pull in order to avoid using the prop shark, basically.
But
you know,
when I saw that film, age 10 in the cinema, believe you me, that shark was realistic as anything.
And I think it still works so well. But I think for me, it works those moments when we get the point of view and the legs and the music, of course, John Williams' score that kind of substitutes for the shark itself. You know, but yeah, I can see that it's a difficult thing to pull off, and this movie does require more kind of practical effects, makeup effects, that kind of thing.
Snakes are interesting. I mean, there is a film which I've not seen from, I think, 1944 called The Cobra Woman.
Oh, yeah.
Which I sort of uses that idea again of a sort of Eastern cult, a Southeast Asian cult that sort of worships snakes. But I don't know, in films, there is that film Snake, which I don't know whether you're going to be looking at that.
No, we are going to be doing Venom with Oliver Reed,
which I've not seen.
Yeah,
no,
1981, I think.
Oh, I'm looking forward to. Yes. One of the things I like about Evolution of Horror is the films I've not seen.
Yes, and
things that bring me up to date.
There are a lot of fun, trashy classics to talk about this series, I think, particularly. But yes, snakes, you know, they do recur. We've got Anaconda in the 90s as well.
Right,
with a really bad CGI snake. You know, again, you know, it's finding ways to realize them on screen in an effective effective way, because snakes are scary. I wouldn't want to come across a snake in the wild, to be honest.
No.
You know? It's the way they move. It's how quick they are, I think, you know.
Yeah, and of course using them in films like Kill Bill with the mamba.
That is a really scary moment in Kill Bill with the suitcase of money and the black mamba popping out. You know? It's great.
And the fact they're all named after snakes.
Yes. Yeah. So I think, you know, that is kind of quite effective. The uses of the bites and the music and the, you know, all those moments. But I agree, when it comes to actually showing her with the makeup, the snake reptile makeup, less effective. Maybe.
Roy Ashton does his best, but it's a bit like the Hound.
Yeah, exactly. And apparently Jacqueline Pearce found it very uncomfortable, didn't want to do, I think she said after this movie she didn't want to do any more movies that involved prosthetics and that kind of heavy makeup, because apparently it's very uncomfortable to be in. So yeah. What should we talk? Let's talk about that strange dinner party sequence in the middle, the kind of centerpiece of the movie, right? Yes. Very strange. She's sent upstairs, like you say. She's not allowed to come down for dinner, and then she is brought down after dinner for a bit of music, right? Plays a bit of sitar.
And for audiences in 1966, you know, Sgt. Pepper comes out the following year, and you've got sort of the George Harrison era. Composition. Yes. So that's probably the first time people started to hear the sitar. So it's a very strange moment in the film, and I think it is pivotal. I still can't quite work out what's going on. It's both funny, it's sexy, it's very disturbing. So she starts playing the sitar. She's dressed in a sari, and again, we're never quite sure that whether she is mixed race, whether the fact she spent all of her time out in Malaya and Borneo and presumably Indonesia, whether she's adapted to customs. It's interesting, there's a great line when he takes them when Franklin takes them into dinner, and he says, "I hope you like the subtle taste of Oriental food."
Yes. And they said, "Oh, I've never had it."
No. And probably nor had audiences very much in 1966.
No, of course.
Probably a Vesta curry. There's a horrible refrigerated curry that was ubiquitous in the 70s. But anyway, she starts playing the sitar. And then she starts playing this tune, and the camera then tracks onto the Malay servant who is watching. Yeah. But the effect it has on her father, who is smoking a cigar, and she's looking at him in a sort of both defiant but also sexual way. Yes. He is both becoming either sexually aroused or disturbed.
Angry or disturbed.
Is the tune somehow connected with the cult, with the snake cult? There is that assumption, and it really sort of builds almost to a climax.
Yes.
Which results in him throwing his cigar into the fire and then picking up the sitar,
smashing it. Stop.
And meanwhile,
the poor Spauldings who are just
sitting there, looking more and more disturbed.
It reminds me of one of those. You know, we've all been there. You're at a house party. Somebody pulls out an acoustic guitar. You do just want to smash it up. You know.
Yes. I wonder if or at parties.
Yes, exactly. No.
Yes. Well, Animal House does that most brilliantly, doesn't it, with John Belushi?
Yeah, it's so funny, but it is a good moment, isn't it? It's quite an atmospheric moment.
Yeah, I do. Yes, and it's as you say, and because it's never explained as to why that's there,
and of course there is, you know, it is. These movies, you know, we talked about this a bit with Devil Rides Out, didn't we? And the sort of othering of other cultures.
Yes.
And, you know, I think, how do you find that in this particular... You've got the character of the Malay as well.
Yes.
You know, how do you find that, the way in which it uses or appropriates kind of Indian culture, I suppose, as part of this horror story?
It does. So, I mean, Hammer have got there is that fear of the foreigner. Yeah. And it's there in The Devil Rides Out. You know, most of the occultists are from the Indian subcontinent and beyond. At least Hammer didn't get people to black up. So Mayor, what's his Mayor? I can't remember the name of the actor who played him.
Marn Maitland.
Right? Yes, who was Indian.
Yes.
You know, he plays him really well. He has a small part, but he has a sort of dignity to him that it's actually Franklin who has interfered in their culture, and this is what this is how you're going to have to pay. But Hammer have some films like Stranglers of Bombay and Terror of the Tongs, where you've got Christopher Lee yellowing up, and of course then Lee does those Fu Manchu films. Yes, but then Hammer are not alone in that. I think the whole idea of empire and colonialism is handled quite well in this film, because Franklin is shown to be the person who has interfered.
Yes.
As a sort of white usurper. So you can read this film. We often read films now through the lens of race and empire, and colonization very differently, which makes these films fascinating in a new way that audiences in 1966 would probably not have done so. So I liked what they did, that they didn't have to yellow up.
Yes.
They didn't have to, they actually used an actor. Because often the excuse you get in films and theatre of the time is that we couldn't find the actors, which is absolute nonsense.
Of course. And Marn Maitland, just looking at his filmography, he was in absolutely hundreds of films and always playing these kinds of bit parts. He was kind of the British kind of Indian character actor, I think, at this time, But yeah, I agree with you. And I think, the way in which these different characters are portrayed is interesting, because who's the real kind of villainous character in this? Kind of interesting. Is it Anna? Is it the Malay? I think even Dr. Franklin isn't the most likable character as well, right? So like you say, it's maybe got a bit more to it than what initially meets the eye,
Well, he's interesting, Franklin, because he's responsible for, Anna is obviously responsible for, killing Charles, but you see Franklin laying flowers on the grave.
Yes.
So there is a guilt at what's happening. Yeah. So on the one hand, the Malayan manservant is a villain. Mm-hmm. But also at the same time, Franklin has brought this on himself. He's interfered in things he should not have done.
Yes, indeed. And finally, then, how do you find the way in which the film kind of culminates in that final, like you say, the sulfur pit, the fire, the window smashing? It's a lot going on, isn't there?
Yes, Hammer are always in a hurry sometimes to finish things off. So there is a fire. There is there's a fight scene. The Malayan servant is drowned in the sulfur pit, but it's a rather pathetic ending where the window is smashed, and then you see Anna for the first time underneath, and I think there's something quite poignant in that. So she dies of cold.
It's kind of like you say, a bit pathetic, a bit sad, a bit somber.
Yes, and they rescue the cat. Luckily that poor little cat gets rescued at the end.
Yeah, exactly. And then, like you say, classic Hammer, ends with a fire, credits roll, done.
On we go.
Yes. Yes. Fantastic. How well do you think this movie holds up in comparison to Hound of the Baskervilles?
I think it's on a par.
Yeah.
I think that it's a minor Hammer film, but I think all sorts of interesting things are going on in this. It's a short film as well, so it's a great film to put on of an evening. As I say, double bill with Plague of the Zombies. I think you've got a cracking Friday night in. Have some subtle tasting Oriental food.
Perhaps play some sitar,
some music.
Yes. Incredible.
Froth at the mouth.
Yeah, perfect. Get your black cat on the sofa with you. Perfect. A perfect night in. Wonderful. Well, Graham, thank you so much for joining me. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. And remind people, where can they come and find you? You're on all the social medias, aren't you, Graham?
Oh yes, I'm MySpace, Friends Reunited, Bebo. Yeah, you can find me on those. No, I'm based at the University of Birmingham. I am on Facebook, and I do sort of post on the Evolution of Horror Facebook site from and like lots of things. But you can email me if you wanted to at the University of Birmingham. If you're interested in doing a PhD in the horror film, we have some fantastic staff at Birmingham. Kat Lester, in the film department, works on children's horror films, and also she's just done an edited collection on Watership Down.
Oh wow, gosh!
Yeah, and conference on Watership Down. So Birmingham is the place to come for devotees of horror cinema who want to pursue it academically.
Fantastic. Love that. Well, Graham, thank you very much. And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my brilliant guest, Graham Saunders. Always such a joy to get together with Graham and talk about Hammer horror. So let us know your thoughts on this week's episode. Let us know your thoughts on Hound of the Baskervilles and The Reptile. What did you think of these two movies? Get in touch. You can email me, evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can also find us on all the socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd, etc. And if you want to discuss this week's episode with fellow listeners, you can join the Evolution of Horror discussion group on Facebook or the Evolution of Horror Discord. And don't forget, over on our Discord, we are now going to be hosting weekly watch-alongs every Sunday night where we watch the movie that's going to be covered the following Friday in our Nature Bites Back series. This podcast is part of the Evolution of Horror network, and if you want to check out our other EOH network pod, it's called The Detective and the Log Lady, in which Stacey Ponder and I watch and discuss every episode of David Lynch and Mark Frost's Twin Peaks from beginning to end. The first few episodes of that are available right now. The podcast is running weekly and new episodes are out every Monday. That's The Detective and the Log Lady, which you can find wherever you get your podcasts. You can find this podcast in all the usual podcast places, and if you get a spare minute, I'd be so grateful if you could drop us a little rating and review on Apple Podcasts or whichever app you use, as that always really helps us get discovered by new listeners. So, on to next week then. And if some of you are going to be feeling like this week didn't really fit the theme closely enough, and I'm sure many of you will, and many of you will get in touch to let me know that that's the case, then have no fear, because I don't think anyone can argue with the importance of next week's movie when it comes to the theme of nature biting back. Next week, I am going to be joined by the incredible Alexandra Helen Nicholas, and we are going to be discussing just one movie, one of the all-time masterpieces of this subgenre. We are going to be discussing Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds from 1963. Join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.